There is an incredible domino effect that can be seen in the methods that God uses that are the expressions of His divine mercy and grace. It's not always that we see them as merciful. It's not always that we see them as an act of grace. But when you get to see the whole picture, you see the whole plan, so to speak, when you get to see the whole puzzle, I've used that metaphor here a little bit lately. Been doing a lot of puzzles with my son, feeling physically so tired and so weak. I never was really somebody that did a lot of puzzles all the time, but that's been something I can do with my son while I'm undergoing this chemotherapy. We can sit together and we can work on puzzles, and it's something that gives me an opportunity to be with him, even though I can't be as physically present with him, and the type of things I would normally do, like maybe going hiking or out throwing a ball around with him. I just can't do that right now while I'm going through this particular process I'm going through presently, but I can give him that. And so I'm trying to give him as much attention as I can in every way that I can, as I want to do with all my children. But because of that, the concept of a puzzle's been in my mind some lately, I suppose. And that is how a puzzle fits together. Some of the pieces are dark. Some of the pieces are lighter. Some of the pieces don't even really make sense when you look at what's on the piece. It doesn't look like it fits in the place where it fits when you first look at it, until you step back a little bit and then you see 3 or 4 pieces together and you see how they each bring about the picture that you wouldn't otherwise see. But when you see sometimes one piece of a puzzle, it doesn't look like it even belongs to that picture until you see it fit into the scheme of the whole puzzle. And that's true in terms of the plan and purpose of God as well. God's plan and purpose is a mysterious thing. There are things that happen, there are events that just don't make sense to us in the moment, and sometimes they don't make sense to us for years, if not for the rest of our lives, if God doesn't reveal them to us. But we have to have faith in the divine architect that He knows what He's doing in the construction of our lives. And unfortunately, the construction of our lives, in terms of building us into a temple for His presence throughout eternity, requires deconstruction of a lot of things that are part of our makeup or part of our thinking, or even perhaps actions that we're doing that need to be changed. But I've found it fascinating how often in life, when you look back on some of this series of events God takes you through, how you'll find there was a domino effect to the events. There may have been 5 or 6 very negative events from our perspective negative, and maybe negative from any perspective. But when you put them all together, when you put them into the puzzle, you see how they make up the picture that gets you to the final place God wants you to be, to the final completion of God's purpose. I was reminded this morning of an event in my youth that heavily impacted my life. And like the name of a book and kind of a television series that I saw advertised, it happened through a series of unfortunate events. They were unfortunate from my perspective. They were just one negative thing after another, but they were powerfully fortunate in their end result, because even though each one of them taken individually could be seen as very unfortunate and negative things, in the end result that they produced, they brought about something that likely could not have been produced any other way, that was far greater for my benefit and for the benefit of my family and for the benefit of the church that I pastor and the churches that I work with here and overseas, and whatever calling God has on my life that I pray will continue past this present crisis. Those events led to me being who I am today. Those events led to me being in the position I am today, whether people would put that together or not. I had to be disconnected from some things in my past, and those things had to be disconnected so forcefully and so permanently that I couldn't wander back to them again. And that's often the case. If we have a way to get back to some of the things in the past that we did or felt or whatever the case might be that had a negative impact on our spiritual relationship with the Lord, there is always the possibility we'll do so. We need to burn those bridges, and sometimes the events that God takes us through burns the bridges back to the past. And that certainly was the case in this series of events that I've got on my mind this afternoon. I was born in the church, as most of you know, and among our body of churches. I came into the church in 1971 in the arms of my mother. I didn't come in on my own steam. I didn't come in walking through the doors. I came in the arms of my mother, who was one of the founding members of the church there in Greene, and that church had come into the body some years before that. Back in the 40s, that church came in the body, and 20-some years later, I came in through my family, who had been part of the beginning of that church, with Brother George White's family. And I grew up in the church, and as so many times happens when you grow up in an environment where you have what amounts to a silver spoon in your mouth, whether that's natural or spiritual, if you're not careful, you can lose the value of what you've been given because it's been so freely given. You didn't have to earn it. You didn't have to fight your way in. If you're born into the body or born into a church, you didn't necessarily have to have a vision before you came in or get a vision when you came in. You didn't have to go down to the altar, initially at least, and give your life to the Lord. You didn't have to go through that process when you're born into a church or the body, because for a period of time at least, you're under the covering of your parents. They certainly went through that process at some point if they're there in the church and part of God's economy, but you're under their covering for a while. So there's benefits that are being given to you. You didn't have to do anything to receive. You didn't even have to repent to receive some of the benefits you receive as a small child. All you have to do is just be connected through your family line to the God that your family line is in a relationship with, your parent or parents. And I had that great benefit. And I did go through my own experience as a child with the Lord. So I went through much of the process of what you go through in the initial stages of salvation. I did it as a very young person, and we have to be very careful. It is a precious thing to watch a child give their heart to the Lord. It's a precious thing to see a child baptized in water. I've baptized many myself. It is a precious thing to see a child filled with the Holy Ghost. But we need to realize they are still a child, and there's a level of maturity that they may not have at that point that not only requires them, like it does with all of us, to continue to keep that gift alive, but it should cause us to be very careful in assuming anything about that child's relationship with the Lord if they're not yet mature enough to understand that relationship properly. It's so critical they understand their part in their relationship with the Lord. It's not just something that happens to you when you receive the Holy Spirit. There's something that has to happen in you. Part of what happens in you is something you do need to be somewhat conscious of in a mature enough understanding of it. And so even if a child is filled with the Holy Spirit, as I've certainly seen happen, we need to make sure that child continues to have experiences in the Spirit, so as they grow older, their initial experience, which may have been at a very young age, will be anchored and reinforced by those later experiences. But coming back to the point, as I said, I grew up in the church and I went through the process of what are the initial steps on the path of righteousness, on the way of salvation. But as a teenager, due to a number of reasons, I started to disconnect from the church. Some of that was due to hurts that had happened, and they were hurts that happened in the church. You're going to be hurt in the church. The church is made up of human beings, and human beings will hurt one another at times. There's things they'll say that will hurt you. There's things they'll do that will hurt you. And sometimes you're hurt even by things that weren't done to you, but by things that disappoint you. Perhaps a leader or someone you looked up to doesn't live up to your expectations. That can deeply wound an individual. And I was wounded by some things in the church. I might have thought I had an excuse to leave the church. You don't ever have an excuse to leave your relationship with the Lord. There are some churches that you might want to leave if it is an abusive environment. But if you know God led you to a place where God has set you and placed your name, you have to be very careful not to make a decision that will take you out of that place, because God can replace leaders, and He has done it. God can replace individuals, and He can, through terrible judgment sometimes, replace individuals or remove individuals who have failed Him. But if God still loves a church, that church is still His, and we need to recognize the difference between the ministry and the church, or between leaders and the church. The leader is not the church, and he's not to replace the church. He's not to replace Christ either in your heart. The church is something bigger than any one man, because all of us are going to be gone at some point. At some point in this life, if we do not live until Christ returns, we'll eventually exit our present roles and responsibilities. And that being the case, the people need to be taught that this is not about putting all of your attention and, unfortunately, at sometimes even over-aggrandizing the person who is in an office. The office is a very critical thing, but the office is just that. Many men may fill an office. We should honor those men if they hold true to that office, if they prove that office, if they demonstrate that they're worthy of that office by their actions and their attitudes. But we don't idolize men. We don't idolize anybody but God and His dear Son, Jesus. And we need to understand that. That could be part of what hurt me when I was a young person, was being disappointed by certain things. But that is not an excuse for you to cut off your relationship with the Lord because things happen you don't understand, or things happen that are so terrible that you think, why would God allow this? There are terrible things that have happened in the economy of God that are the result of men's choices, not God's design. And there are terrible things that have happened in the economy of God that are part of God's design, and we need to be able to be wise enough to step back and wait and watch and see where God goes with certain things. I don't mean God did something evil. There are times when evil is done that is a test to those who are watching, not only to learn not to do the same evil, but also how to respond to that evil, or how to hold steady when evil is occurring, and wait on the Lord to deal with certain things that sometimes are outside of our purview. I don't want to spend a lot of time on that. I want to come back to my issues, because I don't want to make this about someone else's issues. They aren't about someone else's issues. Our choices are our own. What choices we make, we have to take responsibility for. You cannot blame it on the devil, or you can't blame it on anyone else. There are influencers. People that are leaders can influence us, and they can influence us in a positive or a negative way, but our choices are still our own, and we have to take responsibility for our choices. And one of my choices when I was a young man, as a teenager, is that I left the Lord. I left the Lord for several years. Through about half of my teenage years, I was in and out of church, if not out entirely. And during that time, I was part of a group of friends. I might call them co-conspirators or co-criminals, because we were spiritually and naturally criminals in one sense or another that were detrimental to my serving the Lord. Anytime you get in an environment or associated with a group that is detrimental to your relationship with the Lord, you need to leave that environment or leave that group. You have far less potential as one individual to change the entire group that is evil than they do to change you. And you might think you're strong enough that I'm going to make a change in this group. And I thought I was at one point in the group I'm talking about. Thought I could make a positive change, and I found out I wasn't big enough to do it. You need to realize that your environment and the people you associate with can have a major detrimental effect on your relationship with the Lord if it's the wrong environment, the wrong kind of people. The group that I was a part of was essentially constituted of what you might call brothers in arms. A lot of individuals, most of who, like any gang or militant type of brotherhood, would have laid down their lives for one another without any reservation. And that group was something that I was part of founding. And it became a replacement for the family of God, for a young man who'd been slowly leaving the latter for the former. As I said, I thought I was justified because of some hurts that I'd taken. I thought I was justified because of some things that had disappointed me. But at the real heart of it was my own desire for my own self-will and a rejection of what I knew was God's will for my life. Part of what I knew was God's will for my life at that time was the call to the ministry that He'd placed on me very clearly and very distinctly several times before I was a teenager, the most distinctive which was when I was only 12 years old. And I accepted that call as a child. I accepted it in my heart. I told the Lord I would do what He asked me. But as I passed into my teenage years, my resistance to that call just got stronger and stronger. I wasn't someone who, as a young man, had a ministerial itch. You know what a ministerial itch is? That's a condescending statement that's sometimes made to young men who are studying for the ministry or have a desire to be in the ministry, and it's a condescending way of saying they've got a hunger for a position. We need to be careful using those kind of words, because somebody who you might look at and think they just are driven by a ministerial itch may actually have a ministerial calling on their life, and you could put yourself in a dangerous position with God making fun of that calling or of the individual who may be struggling with that calling. I was the opposite of somebody that had a ministerial itch. I had watched men that I loved, including my own grandfather, that suffered terribly in ministerial positions, and I didn't have any desire at that point in my life to make the, at times, terrible sacrifices that are necessary to fulfill that calling as it should be fulfilled. A ministerial calling is intended to be self-sacrificial in its service, not self-seeking or looking for self-glory or self-centered or self-aggrandizing, or by living off the people rather than living and dying, if you understand what I mean by dying, for the people. We have to die to ourselves for the sake of the people. We have to die out so that the church can have greater life in it, just like Jesus did. That's the calling of a leader in the church. We're not there to receive a lot of benefits and things from the people. We might, because many times the ministerial office requires a full-time investment where you may not be able to pay your own bills, or you may not be able to afford to have a home, and the people will have to support you to some degree. But we don't go into the ministry for the benefits. We go into the ministry to make the sacrifices necessary because we love the people that we are ministering to. The sacrifices we make are not for ourselves or for the people that we love. And the ministerial life, and the life of any Christian for that matter, is not one that is aimed at receiving benefits in this life. It's about giving all of ourselves in this little window of existence that we've been given in this temporal life we're presently living, knowing that the one to whom we give all of ourselves to is not only worthy of us doing so, but He's so terrible, and I'll explain that word in a few moments, in His mercy and in His grace, that if we're faithful to Him, He will be faithful to us. And the result of His faithfulness and its eternal benefits will be greater than any sacrifice we might make on this side of the resurrection. I've been saying all this to lead into the story that I want to talk about, which is actually several stories that for much of my earlier life I didn't realize were even connected until I was far enough away from them to look back and realize there was a series of events that happened that in and of themselves were each negative, but that led to a very powerfully positive end result that I can see God's fingerprints over every bit of it, including the worst things that I endured. And it's an incredible example of the way that God's mercy and grace works in paths that at times might appear to be littered with the worst possible conditions and that seem to be heading in the worst possible direction, at least as our limited sight allows us to understand and as far as we're able to see down the path. So on to the story. When I was in the midst of my later teenage years, I ranged between being entirely out of church, as I said earlier, and entirely opposed to being in the will of God, to being 1 foot in and 1 foot out. The latter, in a lot of ways, can be worse than the former because it encourages the devastatingly incorrect idea that we can serve God in part, on our terms and on our schedule. When you think you can serve God with 1 foot in church and 1 foot out, doing things that are clearly displeasing to God, while claiming that you're going to go ahead and go to church or keep in contact with the people of God or whatever else by showing up once in a while you're doing wicked and evil things in the eyes of God, you are deceiving yourself in a worse way than if you just left church entirely. You cannot serve God in part on your own terms and on your own schedule. You are either going to serve God entirely or you're not truly serving Him at all. He never has put out an advertisement for workers or any invitation to labor in His kingdom asking for part-time workers. He's not looking for part-time workers. He's only seeking full-time laborers in the kingdom and individuals who will not only work the whole day, but they'll work with all their might, whether they're under the heat of the sun or the beating of the rain or whatever conditions they might have to deal with. They'll give everything of themselves to the work, everything of themselves to their relationship with the Lord and with the people of God. So during that time when I was entirely out of church, or maybe at best what amounted to being inconsistent, an inconsistent in my heart and attendance visitor, in quotes, because that's all I was at some times. They'd be surprised if I showed up. During that time, I was becoming deeper and deeper entrenched in my resistance to God's will and in my dedication to things like the group that I talked about outside of His church. At the height of that period, when I'm sure it appeared probably to all of my precious church family, as well as my natural family, that I was so far gone I'd never come back to God, I had a series of events I mentioned earlier that occurred that were, in my view at that time, all negative in nature, but that I know now without the slightest doubt were the working of the will of God to lead me exactly and precisely where He always intended me to be. The beginning of this particular story starts with me buying a car, believe it or not. I purchased a car. It was a Pontiac Grand Prix. As young as I was, in order to get the car, me and one of my closest friends that was part of this group that I was a part of had to be co-signers and co-owners of the car, essentially. We both put our money down and we went together in terms of being co-signers on that loan. During the same time, I was working at a construction company where several of the church people had worked and were working. The car, which is a pretty important part of the story, as you'll see, was what allowed me to work the job, which is what allowed me to pay for the car. So I had to have the job and the car in order to keep the job and the car. Most of the work I was doing was related to basement repair on homes that had recently been built or on foundations of homes that were being built that had just recently been laid or were in the process of being laid. One morning I came out to the job site to find that the other workers that day had called off and the company had sent a handful of temporary workers to fill in. And because I was the only employee of the company, I was responsible for them to tell them what to do and what needed to be done. There had been a great deal of rain the night before, which had filled up the foundations of a house that had been under construction. The only thing there was the foundations, and there was a trench around those foundations, and it had a lot of water in it that they wanted to get out of there so they could check the foundations and make sure there wasn't anything that needed to be repaired. And we were tasked with pumping out as much of that water as possible. In order to do that, I had to go down to our supply store and rent several pumps. I was the only person on the job site who could do it, given that all the other workers were only temporary help. They weren't employees of the company. When I got back with the pumps, I pulled into the job site to find that all the temporary workers had somehow gotten beer and were sitting around the site drinking and carrying on. But that's not the worst problem. During that time, the owner of the company had stopped by to look over the site. And as the only employee of the company that was present to oversee these folks, he held me accountable for their actions, and it ended up in me being fired that day. For some odd reason, I never attempted to argue with that action or to explain that I couldn't be accountable for their actions when I was required by the company to leave to pick up supplies and there was no one to watch them. I just got in my car and I started the long drive home to my grandparents' house where I was living at the time. As I pulled out, I was somewhere between angry and anxious. I was angry about what I thought was an unfair judgment that I had just received in losing my job, and I was anxious about the results because I didn't know how I could continue to make my car payment without a job. And at that particular point in time, jobs weren't easy to come by, especially for somebody as young as I was without a lot of job experience. Despite the fact that I wasn't living in a right relationship with God at the time, about halfway home, I started to feel the Spirit moving into the car. And almost in spite of myself, I began to sing songs about the goodness and the faithfulness of God. By the time I got home, I was so deep in the Spirit, and a state of peace had come over me that I could not explain. I wasn't mature enough to understand the concept of trusting in God in the midst of these kind of conditions can bring that kind of peace. When I walked in the door, my grandmother, who I was living with at the time, asked me why I was home so early, and I told her, smiling nonetheless, that I had just lost my job. But it would be all right because I could feel the peace of God all over me. I don't know what she thought of that, considering I was hardly coming to church, and she knew I had to have that job. I don't know what she thought about the fact that I was clearly covered by the Spirit after having just lost my job. Somewhere in those events is usually where I've ended the story when I've given that part of my testimony in church, usually making the point that even in times when it doesn't seem like it's possible for you to be at peace with a loss or a negative situation, God can give you peace, even in surprising ways. But that's not the end of the story. And as Paul Harvey used to say, and I'll paraphrase him, the rest of the story is in many ways even more significant than that part of the story. Going back to what I mentioned earlier, I was surrounded during this time by friends, what you might call brothers, outside the church. I don't mean spiritual brothers, I mean brothers in arms, brothers in the endeavors that we were doing that were by no means godly, many of whom would have and did put their lives in jeopardy for me. One of the closest of those was the individual who co-signed for the car that we now didn't know how we were going to pay for. One day I was driving in the car with the little brother of my very closest friend, who I still love and who's still often in my thoughts and prayers. His little brother later died in a tragic event that was related to some of the activities we did during that time that I'm not going to go into here, but he and I were driving and we pulled into the parking lot of a restaurant to turn around, and as we were driving slowly through the parked cars, a strange and undeniably supernatural event happened. Just before we were getting ready to pass a brand new top-of-the-line Mercedes-Benz, I felt the accelerator move down under my foot. I mean, without my pressure on it. My foot wasn't even touching it by the time it got to the floor. It literally went down to the floor, almost like when you're turning up your cruise control to a higher speed and the pedal moves down into the control of that cruise control. I touched nothing with my hands or feet, but that pedal started to move down towards the floor and we started to pick up speed. At the same time, I felt the wheel start to jerk towards the right, and I tried to wrestle it back, but it literally pulled out of my hands with a hard jerk and slammed us directly into the side of the Mercedes. For many years, I was convinced that the events of that day were the work of an evil spirit, and I certainly do believe in evil spirits. I have had experiences with evil spirits that undeniably have proven their existence to me, and I had those experiences when I was entirely in my right mind. They were not the product of somebody that was insane or not in their right mind, as some might argue. I was entirely clear-headed in my right mind and have had experiences with evil spirits, but looking back on this with hindsight, I don't believe it was the work of an evil spirit. I believe it was an angel of the God of heaven that he sent to deliver me from my condition, and through that strange act, God does some strange acts, saints. Through that strange act of causing me to wreck that car, it led to a series of events, which you'll see in the story that follows, that delivered me from a condition that probably I would have never been able to be delivered from otherwise. We did some pretty heavy damage to the Mercedes, but far worse to our vehicle. The front end was pushed up almost to the wheels. It was totaled. How it was able to continue driving for any amount of time was beyond me. But in the state that I was in at that time, in terms of my life, being a criminal in spirit and action, it never crossed my mind to stay and face the repercussions. Instead, we hastily left the parking lot and got on the highway to try to sprint as far as we could from the scene of the crime. It's amazing that car got several exits before it died, considering the damage that had been done to it. But after it died, we got out and abandoned it and made our way to a place where we could call somebody and get picked up. And after we got out of the area, again, remember, I was a little more than a criminal at this time, so forgive me, I would never consider doing this today. We called it in as a stolen vehicle, hoping the insurance company would cover it and we would be off the hook since we could just claim somebody else took it and wrecked it. Unfortunately, the insurance company was not willing to cover the whole vehicle even though it had been totaled, and it created a major financial burden for me and for this friend of mine who had co-signed for this, which was the beginning of a crack in our relationship. It's kind of astonishing looking back on it now that either of us would probably have been willing to step in front of a bullet for the other. But in this financial situation, money became the thing that separated us. And it started to drive a wedge between us because, of course, he felt, and rightly so, that I had created this problem that now was going to hurt both of us financially. And slow but sure, that crack started to widen in all kinds of strange and unusual ways where it started to break apart some of my relationships with other people that were part of this group. Most of those ways had nothing to do with anything to do with the car that had caused the rift between he and I. They had to do with all kinds of other strange events that kept happening that would take me quite a bit of time to explain, and some of which I would prefer not to explain given the nature of the events. But they slowly started to drive wedges between me and some of these other individuals. What's so significant about that looking back is the fact that prior to that, there was almost nothing that could have broken our relationships. We would have literally fought to the death for one another. And in some cases, I had friends that did die, that are stories that I have not told, and at least at this point, I would prefer not to tell, where I lost people that I loved because of the violence of the world that we were living in. But prior to the beginning of those events with that vehicle, there was such a strong bond between us as a gang of individuals, if you want to call it that, as a group of individuals, that really nothing would have been able to separate it. I felt closer to them, as horrible as this sounds now looking back on it, as I did to my family or to the people in the church. I felt a deeper bond of brotherhood with them at that time than I even felt with individuals that had been in the church. And people in the church were trying all during that time to reach out to me, get me to come back to church. But there was a hardness in my heart that just could not be broken through by any words or any even emotional appeals by people that I knew loved me. But it was as if a barrier had been created. I'd armored myself against those emotions. And no matter how strong their appeals, and no matter how genuine I felt them to be, they could not get through that armor. But God started to break the armor when I lost that job. Little did I realize. He created another crack in the armor when I totaled that car, and the relationship with one of my closest friends was strained. He created more cracks through a variety of other strange and unusual events where things happened that I felt like I had to do something about. And when I took the actions that I took or said the statements that I said to the individuals, it created another rift. And one after another, rifts were created that would have seemed impossible to have ever occurred just a few months prior, all beginning with the events of this story I just told. That led to a day when one of the brothers in the church invited me to church. Now, by the way, I had been invited to church many times during the time that I had left by people that I loved dearly, and I had every time rejected their invitation. I always had an excuse, or I just coldly rejected it, which I pray they forgive me for now. But this brother invited me to church, and he said, the ministers are all going to be coming for a fellowship meeting this weekend. Why don't you come out? Just come out for one of the services. Normally, I wouldn't have even considered coming out. And I certainly wouldn't have considered bringing anyone with me from the group that I was a part of, because we were a rough bunch. We all were rough in almost every way you would describe rough, from our appearance, which, believe it or not, now you may find this harder to believe. You'd have to see some pictures. But I had long hair, I wore a couple of earrings, I was a rough-looking individual, and the individuals that were with me were just as rough-looking. We were, to use a word that nobody uses much anymore, ruffians. We were thugs at that time, in almost every sense of the word. Somehow, something touched me when he invited me. Despite the fact that I had been invited many times, as I said before this, something about that invitation reached me that day. I don't to this day know what it was. I don't remember what I felt. I don't remember having any change of heart. I just thought, you know what, I think I will go out tonight, and I think I'll bring some of the guys with me. And I did. I think I brought about 5 of those individuals who were part of the group that I was the leader of at that time. I brought about 5 of those individuals with me, and we sat in one of the last rows in the back. Right in front of me was one of the young ladies that I had grown up with, just a little older than I am. She was sitting right in front of me. She hadn't been in church in a while either, I don't believe. So strangely enough, we were both there. The building was full that night because a lot of ministers had come, and the most senior minister among us was there at the time. And he got up and started preaching and talked for a little while, and then all of a sudden he stopped in the midst of his message and totally changed gears. He hadn't been looking really at us at all the whole service long. All of a sudden, his head turns toward us, sitting in the back. He turned and looked right at us, right at the young lady that was sitting in front of me that had been out of church, and right at me and the gang of individuals that I had sitting with me. And by the way, he did not know me very well. I'd only seen him at large meetings, and he may have known what family I was part of, but I didn't grow up in one of the churches he pastored, nor did I have any kind of close relationship with him growing up. I just knew him and knew of him. So I don't know if he recognized me or not, as rough as I looked. But he looked back at us, and in the middle of that message, which had nothing to do with an evangelistic appeal, he said, "There are some of you sitting here tonight that God's hand is on, and God is calling you home." And then he stopped right there and went right back to his other message as if he didn't even know what he had said, and never did say another word about it, never came up to us after church, never any interaction at all. The moment he said that, it was like a fire went down through my bones. I felt something so strong, and I was fighting it with everything I had. I thought, I don't want to come back to church. I don't want to leave behind what I built and what I have invested myself in. I don't want to humble myself. I don't want to potentially have to fulfill the calling that God has on my life. But something broke, and that is the key word. Something has to break. I've watched so many individuals through the years that have taken a stand against the legacy maybe of their parents or of God or of their church. I'm talking about a spiritual legacy now. Maybe somebody set a standard or laid down a legacy for them, and they left it behind, or they broke from that path and went on a different path, and I've watched them harden themselves. Every action they take on that path hardens them further to God's reaching out to them and to the potential to leave that path. And I've watched some of them that have never left the path. They followed that path to its terrible end of destruction. But God took me from the path against my own will. I didn't even want to be in that service. I certainly didn't want to come back to church at that time. But something reached down inside of my heart and turned a key that I thought had been lost. And the legacy that had been given to me through my family line ignited again inside of my heart. And I thought to myself, what am I doing? I tried my best, strangely enough, after I left that service to get some of my friends, my brothers in arms, as I call them, to come to church with me. And a couple of them did come with me a few times, but as a majority, they walked away. I've never seen them since. It has been decades since I've seen them or even heard their voices. Some of them are gone. Some of them have died because of the lifestyle they continue to live in. Some of them have gone further into that lifestyle and are in a stagnant place spiritually. Some of them are in a place where I'm still praying because I know they love the Lord, that they will turn themselves fully over to His will for their life and turn their back on some of the choices they've made and some of the places and conditions that they are in right now. And I pray that for everyone that has followed that path, because I walked the path. I know the path. I have an intimate knowledge of the temptations that are on that path. I have an intimate knowledge of the power of that path to take control of a person's life. But I also have an intimate knowledge of the power of the Almighty and of the greatness of God's mercy and grace that can reach as far down as we are capable of going and lift us back up into His favor. And He's done that for my life. And when I look back on those events and I see some of the things that He did, I can see the domino effect. I lost that job, which was not right. I hadn't done anything worthy of losing it. To this day, I'm not sure I did anything worthy of losing it. But I lost that job, and that is a very negative thing. It was devastating to me at the time, wondering how I'm going to pay my bills and survive. And again, one of the key things, continue to pay my car payment, get another job. But losing that job led me to some of the other experiences, each of which were negative, by the way, that continued me be on the journey towards the breaking point that had to happen. It started to create fractures in my relationships with those individuals that were outside the church that were not going to turn to the Lord. And my bond to them would keep me from turning to the Lord. And each of those events, each of which were negative, by the way, led closer and closer to the most positive possible event of all, being in a right relationship with the mighty God of heaven. Sometimes those events, which are devastating in the moment to our psyche and our emotions, in which we may not have a solution for in the moment, may be, whether we realize it or not, part of the domino effects of what will lead us to the place where God intends us to be. I'm going through one of those events right now, which I know all of you local folks are very aware of, and our churches that we work with overseas and things are certainly aware of, and most, if not all, of the churches in our body of churches are aware of. And I want to stop here and say, And I pray that everyone hears who has sent us a card or sent us money or other ways that they have supported us will hear me say this, because it's almost impossible with the scale of calls that I've gotten and the number of cards I've received. It's near impossible for me to personally thank each one. But I want you to know how deeply I appreciate the love that this body of people has shown me during this time that I have been dealing with this cancer diagnosis. It is stage 4 cancer, which generally is something that is expected to end in a death sentence, unless there is a possibility of it being affected by the chemotherapy. I had a scan this last week that I'm going to hear the results of this week that is the very first scan since we started the chemotherapy, and I'm praying it's going to show that the chemotherapy is having a progressive result, that it is affecting the cancer. Even if it's not the chemotherapy, it could be the hand of God doing it, which is better yet. But I'm praying this scan will reveal that something positive has been occurring. I have cancer in 2 different parts of my body. I have cancer in my colon, which is where it started, and then it spread from my colon to my liver. The colon was just one mass when they did this scan, but it was causing me a lot of issues that were very tangible issues, things that I could feel and experience all the time that I knew something was wrong, and that's what led us to this diagnosis. On a positive note, I have had none of those issues for a month now. For the last month, after the first few weeks of chemotherapy, the issues that were colon-related stopped on a dime. I was having issues that were very uncomfortable and problematic every single day for the last 2 years, and those issues have all stopped this last month. I haven't had them once, which would lead me to hope that the mass in the colon may have shrunk under the effects of this chemotherapy or just by the mercies and grace of God's own hand touching it. But I don't know yet about what's happening in my liver, and that is the area they were most concerned about because it had a number of masses in both parts of my liver. In the left and the right lobe, there were multiple masses, and that was what clearly they were most concerned about. So I'm hoping we'll get a positive report here this week. But I've told you local saints, and I'll tell anyone else, whatever the report, devastating or a report of deliverance, I will have the same feelings towards my God that I had before I even knew that this cancer was in my body. I love him now more than I loved him before I received this diagnosis. I have more faith in him today, and I trust him more today than before I received this death sentence of cancer. And I am more at peace with the purpose of God in my life and whatever end result he may lead me to than I have ever felt in all of my life. Part of that is the knowledge of some of the very things I learned in the story that I just reiterated, and in many other stories like this I could give that I've experienced. There are sometimes terrible events that occur to us that, whether we realize it or not, are divine acts of mercy to deliver us from something. If cancer is what it takes, and the death that could lead to is what it takes to deliver me from this nature that I am wrestling with, God, take my life if that is the price of changing me. And Lord, if this process can perfect the things in me that need to be perfected, or at least begin that process of perfecting them, and I can go on with a longer lifespan serving you as an example of your love and of faithfulness to you, then God, I ask for your mercy and your grace one more time. You've given it to me more times than I could ever deserve, but I know you can do it again. God's mercy and God's grace, as I said in the very beginning, are not always acts that come across as very merciful in the moment. Sometimes the things God does that we later realize were an act of mercy hurt. They're painful, they're earth-shaking, they're emotionally devastating to us, but we don't realize that God was leading us and allowing a process to occur to us that would bring us to a place we could never come to otherwise. And I'm praying in this body of people, with the struggles we face, not just with COVID, but with many other things that we are presently facing as a body of people. In our local church, with the struggles we face with the loss of precious saints that we dearly love, and with the hammer blows we've received of sickness and other things that have just beaten against the walls of our church in a spiritual sense, that we'll keep growing stronger in our faith, and we'll keep growing truer in our relationship with the Lord, that we will not be moved, no matter what may come against us, that we will stand firm and anchored to the solid rock, praise his holy name, and that nothing will move us from that rock, because whatever events may occur in this present broken world, God is still on his throne, and his divine purpose is still going to be carried out. And if we will yield our lives to him, and if we will invest ourselves entirely in our relationship with him, we are guaranteed to receive the very best of his divine purpose for us and for this world. So thank you, Lord, for your mercy. Thank you, Lord, for your grace. Thank you for the many times you've allowed me to be hurt to help me. I said here the last time I was able to be in service, I've never learned as much in any school or in any training program that I've learned in the school of suffering. The school of suffering is a bitter way to have to learn lessons, but it is one of the most powerful ways to learn a lesson. The teacher in that school is a hard taskmaster, but once you've graduated from that school, you'll have learned lessons that can be learned no other way. And if you take those lessons in the right way, there'll be a strength that is built in you that will endure any process you might have to go through. So I thank the Lord. I thank Him for the many things He's done. And I want to continue with something I said a few moments ago. I want to thank you. I hope everyone that has sent cards to our family will know just how much they mean to us, even if I just simply haven't been physically capable. I'm so exhausted most of the time with the chemotherapy that I'm going through. I just haven't been physically capable of sitting down and writing out thank you notes. Some of the cards I got just tore my heart from my breast with the generosity and love that they expressed, the things that they said that were words of respect and honor or just words of tenderness and love that just tore my heart from my breast. It just humbled me. And I so appreciate them. I'm so thankful for what you've done for us. Going out onto our back deck where we have French doors, all around those French doors are cards that we've put up that have come from around this body of people, from around this country and around the world. A wall of cards. First time I saw that wall going up, as my wife started to put some cards up around the wall, and we've kind of had a tradition of doing that now. Every time we get a card, we put it up around those doors until there's no room left, and it's starting to run out of any room we could put them on the wall now. There's so many cards that have come in. I looked at that as she put up that first card, and the God of heaven touched me, and I said, it's a wall of prayer. Like that precious song. I think it's the McCameys that sing that song. Says there are walls made by man, built by frail and human hands, that an enemy can scale and get to you. But there's one protecting me from my greatest enemy. It's a wall that Satan can't break through. Oh, my brother, when I'm weak, would you stand instead for me and pray a fortress round me strong that can't be moved? And I promise you today, when I bow my knees to pray, I'll do my best to build a wall of prayer for you. The chorus says, sometimes a wall of grace, sometimes a wall of faith, other times it's sweet mercy that I need. But the one for which I long, that makes all the others strong, I need a wall of prayer surrounding me. And I am so deeply grateful for the wall of prayer that this body and the churches and the precious saints and our local assembly has built around me. God, let that wall of prayer accomplish your perfect purpose in me and in our assembly. Let your purpose be brought about in us, whatever the cost, Lord. Praise your holy name.